Who invented the crossover? Correct! Possibly. It was the Nissan Qashqai.
But actually, it wasn't really. The term came into existence with the Qashqai, but that definitely wasn't the first car to look like an SUV without actually being one, which is the simple definition of a crossover.
A good decade before the Qashqai happened, the first Toyota RAV4 was offering drivers the rugged utility of an SUV with the option of more economical front-wheel drivetrains for those not interested in the off-road stuff, which, let's face it, is most people. By the time the Qashqai came along, the RAV4 was well into its third generation and still doing that part SUV, part family hatchback sort of thing. But in the years that followed, the Qashqai was heralded as some sort of family transport revolution, which it sort of was in fairness, while the RAV4 remained an outlier, in sales terms anyway. Arguably, it was as much a victory for PR as it was for design and engineering.
In response, you'd think that for this RAV4, the fifth one, Toyota would just give in to the whole thing, play the Qashqai at its own game, and take a huge slice of the lovely big crossover pie.
But fair play to Toyota, it isn't doing that. Instead, it's breaking bad.
No more half measures, Walter.
True story, the strapline for this new RAV4 is no half measures. And that's because in the UK at least you can only have this as a hybrid. Although you can have it with just front wheel drive, which is sort of a half measure. Oh well.
Anyways, no diesels here, and that's because when Toyota introduced the hybrid RAV4 last time around, within a couple of years sales went from 9 out of 10 being diesel to 9 out of 10 being a hybrid.
The immediate advantage is obvious, because despite being a proper full-sized SUV looking family car type thing, its MPG and its CO2 look like this. And note that that figure comes from the much stricter new WLTP test, so in reality, you're quite likely to get close to that. What's more certain is tax, company car tax specifically. And according to Toyota, you will save thousands in tax over 3 years compared to a similarly sized, conventionally engined crossover, as you can see here on this riveting PowerPoint slide.
On the other hand, the upfront costs if you're a private buyer are quite high.
The cheapest one's starting at around 30 grand. Bear in mind that you can get any number of crossovers from other manufacturers starting at significantly less than this. And with that in mind, you're certainly cancelling out quite a lot of your MPG savings. And on top of that, to be honest, I've never driven a hybrid that I've actually liked. When I drive them, they tend to make me feel like... I can't quite find the words.
Say the words!
Bit like that really. So, is this one any different?
No, it isn't. This is a new hybrid system with an all-new 2.5 litre petrol engine that affords the RAV4 a surprisingly rapid 0 to 62 time, but in character, it's exactly the same, basically. And that means a lot of noise. And all the dynamic vigour of a latter stage Johnny Cash performance.
I hurt myself today.
But let's not forget that this is not the sort of car that you buy for any sort of driver enjoyment. It's an eco SUV basically, and it's not a Porsche Macan. That in mind, and actually again a bit like Johnny Cash, it is brilliant at the gentler stuff.
I would find a way.
It's there that the RAV4 feels right at home. Treat it gently and you're rewarded with the sort of refinement that you just cannot get when you've got a diesel engine chugging under the bonnet. Now it does have an electric only mode, but it'll barely get you to the end of your driveway. Although that doesn't really matter because when you're just going along nice and gently, it is really quiet and refined, whether the engine's running or not. Same goes for the ride quality, which has removed some of that standard hybrid trait of crashing down into potholes and generally being a bit too firm. Now, Toyota has done that by making the body a lot more rigid than it used to be, and that means that it hasn't had to over-tighten the suspension in order to deal with the hybrid's general lardiness. But to be honest, there's still a bit more jaggedness through the wheels than you might want or you might get in a non-hybrid car. But in general, the ride and the body control are good, smooth, pleasant enough.
And as a fat runabout, the good stuff continues. The cabin is really spacious, and especially for rear legroom. And the boot is class leading. According to Toyota, that is, although they've obviously forgotten about both the Peugeot 3008 and the Volkswagen Tiguan.
The silly billies. Oh well, it's still pretty massive.
It is 580 litres large, which is 79 litres more than the outgoing RAV4 hybrid. It also has a twin loading floor as standard, and the deck is quite a bit longer than the outgoing RAV4's too. Well, it's actually 6 centimetres longer. But that could be the difference between driving home from IKEA with the boot closed or driving home from IKEA really slowly with the boot ajar and tied down with string. We've all been there.
The cabin does all the right things too. Now you'll note a hint of the pejorative in my tone there, because while it does the right things, lots of oddment space, reasonably non-baffling cabin, half decent infotainment setup, mostly good driving position.
50% more steering wheel adjustment than the outgoing RAV4, to be exact. Is that right? God, that was a long press conference.
Yeah, while it does all those things right, Toyota never seems to be able to make an exciting cabin. Just not that inspirational in here. You'll get out of it and you'll forget what it looked like almost immediately. But you know, most people will think it's okay. And again, basics are right, visibility's good, high seating position, etc.
That said, there's more soft, touchy stuff than in the average Japanese runabout, and it feels extremely well put together. Ergo, you'll never be able to say about it that
I am the one who knocks.
yeah, I think this Breaking Bad thing's run its course now, hasn't it?
I don't know, Mr. White. Do you think that is?
The reason this has always been called RAV4 is because it's a lovely acronym. It stands for Recreational Activity Vehicle with 4-wheel drive, despite some of them not being 4-wheel drive. Well, for this one, focus groups were established, research was commissioned, and they've come up with something new. And what they've come up with is...
Apparently a vehicle can be accurate. Who knew?
Anyways, it does once again have 4-wheel drive available, for what it matters, and a better system than before, for what that matters also. Aside from being able to send up to 80% of the power to the rear axle, it could only do 60 before, it has an additional and very small electric motor on the rear axle that gives you an instant torque hit, and also helps make the 4-wheel drive one a little bit quicker than the front-wheel drive one, for what that matters also.
So there you go, we've established that it's large, cheap to run, built with fortitude, can do a bit of off-roady stuff if necessary, and much more importantly, it's very refined when it comes to the low-speed, runabouty stuff. In all those senses, it's a very easy car to recommend. However, most of you will venture away from the city occasionally, or quite a lot probably, and therefore will wish to press the throttle far beyond the first 5 or 10% of travel. And as I alluded to earlier, that's where the water's muddy a bit.
Yeah, on the motorway, this thing can just be an absolute cacophony of noise, especially so around the pillars and the wing mirrors. On top of that, any sort of acceleration brings with it that horrific perpetual CVT drone. Again though, it rides okay, so if you just sat at 60 to 70 and you're not accelerating and there's no wind whatsoever, it's kind of okay. Problem is, when you're not driving that calmly or you're overtaking or whatever, most of that refinement goes out of the window, or blows against the window, if you like. Less important but worth mentioning is just how clumsy it feels when you're driving it around anything with a curve on it. Because that's when all the things that make it decent around town, you know, light steering and soft ride quality, they sort of conspire against it. Weirdly, it doesn't actually roll too much, there's not much body roll, but pushing it around a tight corner feels a lot like rolling a Battenberg cake down a hill. It's kind of clumsy and difficult to predict and very unnatural. It actually has driving modes too, one of them called Sport, but if you press the button, I honestly can't tell what the difference is, aside from it being slightly noisier. They would have been better off using that space where the driving mode buttons are as like a sandwich holder or something.
Now, it would be harsh to go on about this too much because it's not designed for that purpose, clearly. But it is worth talking about because a lot of crossovers now are really good at that more dynamic stuff. The Peugeot 3008, for example, which is brilliant fun to drive. And actually, most mid-level crossovers do a much better job at being occasionally fun to drive than this does.
We'll leave that there because, again, not really sure how much of a role driving enjoyment plays in anybody's decision to buy one of these things.
More likely, you'll be thinking about whether it'll fit in your parking space at work and how much stuff it has as standard.
And there, the RAV4 goes back to doing a great job. Now, I've already said it's spacious, but all of the extra space comes by stretching the wheelbase. It's actually a little bit shorter than the outgoing car, and that means that it doesn't feel gargantuan when you're trying to park it or you're nipping around town.
Standard spec is generous too, including lots of stuff that with other manufacturers would probably be in the higher reaches of the range or even optional extras. As a result, your 30 grand icon specification RAV4 is more than likely all the RAV4 that you'll need. And really, all the car you'll probably need is a much more appropriate strapline for the RAV4 than no half measures. Because the RAV4 just works. It doesn't really give you that much more than that. A lot of people, especially if they're company car drivers looking for a high riding and financially prudent family vehicle, and they actually describe it in those terms, they'll find what they're looking for here. Anyone who wants more than that from their car though, something with a bit of personality and that's occasionally more than mundane to drive. If that's you, look elsewhere, because this here is the difference between being appealing on paper and appealing in real life. There you go, thanks for watching, really appreciate your time, and please, if you liked what you've just seen, hit subscribe and hit the notification bell and you'll get a nice email or something whenever we put a new video out, which is usually once a week. See you next week, bye!
I fought the law.
This is us following the police to a cash point, so we're going to pay them €100 to get out of jail.
When the law won, I fought the law and the law won.